the Red Army destroyed the same German division 3 times. Not 3 different divisions that happened to share a name. One division. Raised, broken, raised again, broken again, raised a 3rd time, and broken for good. It ceased to exist at Stalingrad in the winter of 1943. It ceased to exist again in the marshes west of Bobruisk in the summer of 1944. It ceased to exist a 3rd and final time in the ruins of Budapest in February of 1945. 3 deaths in 25 months. And every time the Soviets closed the trap, Berlin pulled the survivors out, handed the name to a fresh batch of recruits, and sent it east to be destroyed once more. By the end of this, you will know which division it was, what happened inside each of those 3 pockets, and how many men walked out of each one alive. You will also know the one thing that explains all of it. The reason Germany kept spending men to rebuild a formation the Red Army kept overrunning is not written on any battle map. It is carved into the front of a stone building in Munich. Hold on to that. We come back to it. Start with the first death, because the first death is the one that set the pattern. In the autumn of 1942, a German motorized division rolled towards Stalingrad as part of the Great Summer Drive East. It was the 60th Infantry Division, motorized, which meant its riflemen moved in trucks and half-tracks instead of on foot. 2 motorized infantry regiments, its own tanks and guns, close to 15,000 men at full strength. It had already crossed half of southern Russia, and now it took its place on the northern shoulder of the city, out on the open steppe where the German line bent back from the Volga. That was a hard piece of ground to hold. The division fought around a village called Orlovka, northeast of the city centre, where the Soviets held a bulge in the German line and would not give it up. The 60th spent weeks reducing that salient house by house, in the kind of close fighting that eats a division slowly. To its right, other units of the same corps had pushed all the way to the Volga bank near Rhynok. That thin strip of ground, the corridor between the city and the river to the north, was the German army's grip on Stalingrad. It was also the place the whole German position could be cut. That shoulder was the weak point, and the Soviet command knew it. On the 19th of November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. 2 Soviet fronts drove into the flanks held by Romanian troops on either side of the German 6th Army. Within 4 days, the 2 arms met near the town of Kalach, west of the city. Everything inside the ring was trapped, roughly 250,000 men, and the 60th Motorized was one of the divisions sealed inside. The commander who had led the 60th through the summer, Otto Kohlemann, had already been rotated out that November before the ring closed. Remember his name. He walks back into this story later, which is part of what makes it strange. Command of the trapped division passed to Hans Adolf von Arenstorff. For 10 weeks the pocket starved. Hitler forbade a breakout. He had been promised the 6th Army could be supplied by air, and the air supply was a fantasy. Do the arithmetic the way the army did it at the time. The trapped force needed something like 300 tons of supply a day just to keep breathing, and closer to 500 tons a day to keep fighting. Across the whole airlift, the transports averaged around 116 tons a day. That is less than a quarter of what the men needed to fight, and barely a third of what they needed simply to survive. The gap was measured in starving soldiers. The temperature on the steppe dropped to 20 degrees below zero and then lower. Fuel ran out, so the motorized division stopped being motorized. Its trucks sat frozen where they were parked. Its men dug into the snow and held their piece of the perimeter on shrinking rations of horse meat and a few ounces of bread a day. The horses that had pulled the guns were eaten. When the horses were gone, there was nothing. In the middle of January, the Red Army launched the final drive to collapse the pocket. The airfields the Germans had been using to receive supplies were overrun one by one, and once the last field was gone, even the trickle of food and ammunition stopped. On the 26th of January, the Soviets drove a wedge through the pocket and split it into two smaller ones, a northern and a southern. On the 31st of January, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the whole Sixth Army, surrendered in the southern pocket. The northern pocket held 2 more days. By then, the ammunition was nearly gone. On the 2nd of February 1943, the last German resistance in the northern half ended. General von Arenstorff went into Soviet captivity that day. The 60th Motorized Division ceased to exist. Here is the number that tells you what that meant. Somewhere around 91,000 German soldiers surrendered at Stalingrad. Of that 91,000, between 5,000 and 6,000 ever saw home again. The rest died in the pocket or in the prison camps in the years that followed. That is a survival rate near 6 in 100. The men of the 60th vanished into that figure. As a fighting formation, the division was simply gone, struck off the German order of battle. That should have been the end of it. A division destroyed at Stalingrad, one of many, a line in a casualty return. It was not the end. It was the beginning, and the reason takes us to that building in Munich. On the 20th of June 1943, in the south of France, the German army raised a new division and gave it the name of the dead one's replacement. It was called Panzergrenadier-Division Feldherrnhalle. The word Feldherrnhalle means the Hall of the Field Marshals. It is a real building, a stone loggia on a square in the centre of Munich, and it was the single most sacred address in Nazi Germany. On the 8th of November 1923, Adolf Hitler had led an armed march through Munich in an attempt to seize power. At the Feldherrnhalle, the Bavarian state police blocked the road and opened fire. 16 of Hitler's followers died on the pavement in front of that building. The coup collapsed and Hitler went to prison. 10 years later, when he ruled Germany, he turned the spot into a shrine. He mounted a bronze plaque with the 16 names. He posted an SS guard there day and night, and every man who passed on the pavement was required to raise his arm in salute. The Feldherrnhalle was the altar of the whole movement, the place the party said its first 16 martyrs had fallen. That is the name they welded onto a fighting division. And the men they filled it with were chosen to match. The recruits came heavily from the Sturmabteilung, the brown-shirted street fighters of the early party, the SA. These were the men who had beaten opponents in the streets of German towns in the 1920s and 30s, the party's own private army from the years before it took power. Now the party turned its street fighters into a real one, with tanks and artillery, and sent them to the front as a matter of prestige. This was to be the party's own division, its political showpiece in field grey. Its soldiers were meant to be more loyal, more fanatical, more willing to hold when regular troops would pull back. And to command it, they brought back Otto Kohlmann, the same officer who had led the 60th Motorized towards Stalingrad before the ring closed. The man who had commanded the division in its first life now commanded its second. He, at least, knew exactly what the Red Army did to a formation it decided to surround. He would find out again. The new division did not go straight east. In September of 1943, when Italy left the war, the Feldherrnhalle was used to help disarm Italian troops in the south of France under the German operation to seize control there. It was police work with tanks, and it was a soft start for a unit that would soon meet the Red Army. In December of 1943, it went back to the Eastern Front, the same front that had swallowed its parent. For half a year it held the line in the centre, through hard defensive fighting around Narva in the north and then around Mogilev in Belorussia. Then came the summer of 1944, and the second death, which was faster and far more complete than the first. On the 22nd of June 1944, 3 years to the day after the German invasion, the Red Army opened Operation Bagration against Army Group Centre. This was the offensive that broke the back of the German army in the east. 4 Soviet fronts hit a line that Hitler had ordered held to the last yard. He had named a string of towns along that line fortress places, each one ordered to hold even after it was surrounded, on the theory that a ring of stubborn strongpoints would break the Soviet advance. Bobruisk was one of those fortress towns. The order did the opposite of what Hitler wanted. Instead of breaking the offensive, it nailed whole divisions in place and let the Red Army surround them at leisure. The line did not bend. It came apart. The Feldherrnhalle was posted near Bobruisk, a fortified town on the Berezina River in Belorussia, inside the sector of the German Ninth Army. The Ninth Army was commanded by General Hans Jordan, who could see what the fortress order was about to do to him and could not talk his own high command out of it. Within days of the offensive opening, he was relieved of command. The disaster went ahead without him. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the 1st Belarusian Front, ran the trap. He sent one arm of his offensive north of the town and another south of it. General Pavel Batov's 65th Army broke the southern shoulder. By the 27th of June, the 2 Soviet arms had met behind the town and 2 full German corps were sealed in a pocket east of the Berezina. The 35th Corps and the 41st Panzer Corps. Tens of thousands of men, the Feldherrnhalle among them. Inside Bobruisk itself, the garrison commander, Adolf Hammann, held a town that was already cut off from everything behind it. What happened in that pocket happened in 3 days. The Soviet Air Force found the trap columns backed up against the river and worked them over from the air without pause. On the 27th, the men on the ground could see huge fires along the eastern bank as the Germans burned their own trucks and guns to keep them out of Soviet hands. There were only a few crossings over the Berezina and everything funneled toward them. The bridges were jammed and then cut, and men who could not reach a bridge went into the river itself, wading and swimming the cold water under fire to reach the western bank. The soldiers who tried to break out west did it mostly on foot, having left their heavy equipment burning behind them. What crossed the Berezina was not an army anymore. It was scattered groups of exhausted men without vehicles, without guns heavier than what they could carry, moving through forest and swamp toward a front line that kept moving away from them. The accounting was brutal. Around 50,000 German soldiers were lost in and around the Bobruisk pocket. Another 20,000 were taken prisoner. Perhaps 12,000 got clear of the ring. On the 28th of June, the German 9th Army was declared destroyed. The commander of the Feldherrnhalle, Friedrich Karl von Steinkeller, was taken by the Red Army. He did not come home for 11 years. The Soviets released him in 1955. Adolf Hamann, who had held the town itself, went into captivity with his garrison, stood trial before a Soviet court for war crimes against the people of the region, and was hanged at the end of 1945. For the second time in 18 months, the division was gone. On the 8th of July, command of what little survived passed to Günther Pape, and there was almost nothing left to command. A division is somewhere near 15,000 men. What walked out of Bobruisk was a few hundred stragglers and the number of a unit that no longer existed. And for the second time, Germany refused to let the name die. The honour title came with a cuff band the men wore on the sleeve, the word Feldherrnhalle stitched into the cloth so that every soldier of the division carried the shrine's name on his own arm. On the 1st of September 1944, in a training camp at Warthalager in occupied Poland, the army raised the Feldherrnhalle again from replacements and survivors. On the 27th of November, it was upgraded on paper and renamed Panzergrenadier-Division Feldherrnhalle. Then it was sent south, into Hungary, toward the last place its name would appear on a map. A city on the Danube called Budapest. By the winter of 1944, the Red Army had driven the Germans and their Hungarian allies back across Hungary and was closing on the capital. Hitler declared Budapest a fortress city, which in his vocabulary meant the garrison was forbidden to retreat and forbidden to surrender. On the 26th of December 1944, the Soviet ring closed around the city. Inside it were roughly 45,000 German and Hungarian troops. Among them, for the third time, was the Feldherrnhalle. The garrison commander was an SS general named Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch, and his orders from Hitler were the same orders Bobruisk had received and Stalingrad before it. Hold the fortress. Do not retreat. Do not surrender. The siege lasted 7 weeks, and it was some of the worst urban fighting of the entire war. 3 times in January, a German panzer corps drove in from the west to break the ring open, a set of relief attacks the Germans code named Conrad. The last one got within 16 miles of the city and could go no further. Each attempt was thrown back short, and each time it failed, the garrison inside grew weaker. The defenders were slowly pressed off the flat eastern half of the city, called Pest, back across the Danube into the hills of Buda. Breach by bridge, block by block, the perimeter shrank. Food ran out. The wounded filled the cellars under the castle hill, thousands of them, with almost nothing left to treat them. By the second week of February, the garrison held only the castle hill and a few streets around it, and Pfeffer Wildenbruch knew the city was finished. On the night of the 11th of February 1945, the garrison tried the only thing left. Pfeffer Wildenbruch ordered a mass breakout on foot, straight through the Soviet lines, aimed at the German position somewhere to the northwest. He did not wait for permission from above. The plan was to push the first wave out through the western edge of the castle district under cover of darkness and fog, some of it moving through the storm drains and tunnels under the hill, and to run for the hills beyond the city. Around 30,000 soldiers and a crowd of civilians surged out of the perimeter in the dark. The Red Army was waiting. Soviet intelligence had read the ground and the likely routes, and the guns were already laid on the exits. The breakout came apart almost as soon as it started. The first waves were caught in the open on the far side of the castle hill, and the columns behind them were broken into fragments, each fragment trying to find its own way through 15 or 20 miles of Soviet-held country. Pfeffer Wildenbruch himself did not get far. He was taken in a tunnel and spent 10 years in Soviet captivity. Almost none of them made it. The generals leading the attempt were lost one after another. Gerhard Schmidhuber died in the streets. Joachim Reborn was wounded and took his own life rather than be captured. Of the great mass that broke out of Budapest, only a few hundred reached German lines at all. And here is the last strange turn in the story of a division that would not stay dead. The largest single group that made it out was Feldherrnhalle. Several hundred of its soldiers, led by a lieutenant colonel named Helmut Wolf, held together through 3 days and nights in enemy country and reached the German lines on the 14th of February. A division that had begun the siege with thousands ended it as a few hundred exhausted men following one middle-ranking officer out of a trap. The fighting formation had come apart a third time. That is the triple death. Stalingrad, where it went into a pocket of 250,000 and disappeared into a survival rate of 6 in 100. Bobruisk, where it was one of 70,000 men lost or captured against the Berezina in 3 days. Budapest, where it walked out of a doomed city as a few hundred survivors under a lieutenant colonel. 3 times the Red Army built the wall around it, and 3 times the division inside came apart. The name outlived even that, barely. In the final weeks, the Germans scraped together one more formation and called it Panzer-Division Feldherrnhalle 1, and its remnants surrendered to the Soviets in May of 1945 at a small Bohemian town. The war ended and the name went out with it. So come back to the question from the start. Why did Germany do this? Why spend the men to rebuild, twice, a division the Red Army had already proven it could destroy? Regular divisions were struck off and forgotten by the dozen. This one was razed from the ground every single time. The answer is the building. Feldherrnhalle was never only a division. It was the party's own name, the address of the 16 men who had fallen on the pavement in Munich in 1923, the shrine the SS guarded and every passerby saluted. To let that name die on a Soviet order of battle return would have been to admit that the movement's holy ground could be overrun like any other. So the name was worth more than the men who carried it. Each time the Red Army destroyed the division, Berlin was not saving a fighting unit. It was defending a memory. and it fed thousands of soldiers into 3 separate pockets to keep a stone loggia in Munich from being proven mortal. The Red Army proved it anyway. The plaque came down within weeks of the surrender, pried off the wall by the people of Munich themselves. The 16 names came off the stone, and the division that had been raised 3 times to honour them was gone, its survivors in Soviet camps or scattered across a ruined continent. In the end, the shrine could not keep an army alive. It only decided where the army would die.